Hey there and welcome once more to Get Indie Gaming. We've made no bones over the years in calling the Metroidvania genre our favourite of the lot, and in this video we're updating our best of the best list and counting down in no real particular order the Metroidvania games we think are well worth playing on PC and the current generation of consoles for this September 2020. Let's get things going with Iconoclasts, a game that might deceive you with its first impressions, and it would be really easy to pass this one by in thinking it's just yet another derivative pixel art game, and the sort that we're hardly short of within the overall indie gaming scene. It's also not obviously a Metroidvania game on the face of things, with all of the exploration and interconnected world all playing second fiddle to the game's puzzling sections, which on balance, alongside with the beautifully dedicated and detailed pixel art, is what's earned Iconoclasts a place in this rundown. These puzzles are deliciously put together and in places fiendishly clever. One of them, and we think you'll know which one if you've played this, had us jumping up and down, punching the air in delight when the solution all clicked together. It can be just one of those games where it puts you, the player, in a position of sheer joy and delight. So yes, Iconoclasts could easily have passed you by, and it really is a hidden gem of the genre, and you can pick this up on Steam, GOG, and all of the top 3 consoles of the current generation. Up next, and a game we've recently gone back to and played over once more following the launch of its recent DLC, Blasphemous, which you can play on PC via Steam and all the usual consoles. But when we first came to this about this time last year, we didn't particularly enjoy it. Our review title kind of summed it all up, where we called it macabre self-flagellation with its obscure storylines, convoluted lore and repetitive enemy generation. And in places, its lackluster combat. Now, having gone back to this again, we're really happy to note how much of this DLC adds to the based game, not just in terms of certain quality of life aspects, but it also adds multiple hours of new story-driven gameplay, but most importantly, the overall combat sections, sequences and gameplay have really been tightened up to make them, well, in some places, more of a challenge, but also this is what we think's really important. It's tightened up certain areas of the combat that made it feel that, well, just a little bit tighter, particularly in boss battles where the game now really does allow for a Dark Souls type of strategy in terms of getting in nice and close, stunning your opponent before delivering the coup de grace. Aside from this, the team have updated the map, making backtracking easier. They've also added improvements to the already stunning pixel art, fast travel points and additional voice acting, which has made Blasphemous how it looks and plays in September 2020 a worthy addition to this Metroidvania rundown. First out in 2016 on the PlayStation 4, PC, Xbox and the PS Vita, we recently got hold of Salt and Sanctuary on the Nintendo Switch, and like so many others have already said, it's one of those mashup games where Castlevania sits alongside Dark Souls gameplay. We say sits alongside, it's very much a tribute to that particular franchise, although what it does with the Castlevania elements well enough to make it into this rundown. Much of this comes from the dark and dinginess of the interconnected dungeons, that is if you have the right settings, as boy this game is dark and dingy. They do however shine through, with there just being enough hint of actual terror all the while playing it. Axiom Verge came out in spring 2015. Now it really does wear its Metroid colours out there front and foremost. So much so that over the years we've seen numerous comments and commentaries saying it's almost an out and out Metroid clone. Although we think that does Axiom Verge a huge disservice. Having gone back and played this again in the course of pulling this video together, this time on the Switch, it does line up alongside Metroid quite well, although it's certainly not a clone. It builds and bulks up what made Metroid so good, particularly in the relationship to how you're able to develop your character and from the huge array of weapons you're able to grab hold of along the way. Also, let's not forget all of this came from one person. The art, design, music, the entire lot, it all came from a single developer, and with a follow-up expected out soon, with what's said to be a timed Switch exclusive, For us at least, that launch can't come soon enough. You can play the original on PC, the Xbox One, Switch and the PlayStation 4. Up next, and a surprise perhaps to nobody who's been following our work here at Get Indie Gaming, Dead Cells came out in early August 2019, and while there are out-and-out elements here you'll find in roguelites, it's chock-a-block full with a multifaceted and deeply connective world that's so very full for exploration and replayability. Following the initial launch, a first DLC, followed by the Bad Seas follow-up, and more recently the Barrels of Fun update from August this year, all told we've put in somewhere in the region of 300 hours playing this, and none of those have felt like a chore. We've often called Dead Cells the best indie game we've ever played, and as this goes out towards the middle of September 2020, we still wholeheartedly stand by this statement. It's a game that adapts to your playstyle. You want action? Well, you got plenty of that. Puzzling, platforming, naturally enough exploration and character development, yes, and yes a multiple of times over. True, early on things can be a little tricky, and yet once you've leveled things up, it gets a whole heap easier. We were slightly critical of the first DLC, which hid some really important aspects of the game's lore behind a difficulty barrier, and yet, well, that's just looking for issues. Dead Cells is simply brilliant across all of its platforms, and you can play this on PC by way of Steam, the PlayStation 4, the Switch, the Xbox One, and also via the Google and Apple App Stores. Next up, we have The Messenger, with us really being torn in adding it to this rundown, as the Metroidvania part of the game isn't there from the start, and only happens once the big twist kicks in halfway through. If you don't want to know what's in all honesty the big spoiler of the game, jump forward a good 30 or 45 seconds from now. Okay, are we all good to go? So, the big reveal and huge spoiler is that the Messenger flips from being an 8-bit to 16-bit aesthetic, and from then on you're able to go about the place exploring the world in true and typical Metroidvania fashion. Once the change happens, we think the game really lifts up, and to be honest, it already was a first-rate title to begin with. The Messenger is super fun, and often tongue-in-cheek with its story and gameplay, and we loved it. You can buy The Messenger on PC, and like many games in this rundown, it's also available on all of the usual consoles you're likely to have at home this September 2020. Up now, and sadly a game we totally missed out on when it first came out in the summer of last year. Monsterboy and the Cursed Kingdom is another hidden gem of the rundown, and it is quite frankly a stunningly wonderful and attractive tribute to Wonderboy. Like Iconoclasts from earlier, it hides its Metroidvania interconnected elements within what's also a cracking action platformer that really benefits from having some super tight and responsive controls, particularly within the combat sections. The other high point, well, it's the ever awesome soundtrack, which really does help make Wonderboy a joyous all-round experience. Our only criticism comes from the slow pace at the beginning, and yet if you power on through, the good stuff comes quickly. Monsterboy and the Cursed Kingdom came out in December 2018, and you can play this on PC, Google Stadia, Switch, the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. Moving onwards, and a few years ago on PC and consoles, we have Yoku's Island Express, where you get to play as a postman dung beetle, in what's also a remarkably good take on a Metroidvania, where you navigate the world by way of platforming, pinball-styled gameplay. Now this quite possibly shouldn't work, and yet it really does, with the only exception being a section towards the very end, where the skill needed to traverse from one part to the other feels so hard that we suspect many just won't be able to get past it, which is a real shame. All that aside, with Yoku's Island Express, we have something that's really rather charming as you go about exploring the island, meeting the folks that live there, most if not all of them having their own jokes, tales and stories to tell. We found this one to be a true delight that rewards quick in and out playstyles as much as it does long and persistent sessions. With so many of these games, while having somewhat of a heavy, shall we say, storyline and associated gameplay, Yoku's Island Express is light-hearted and a welcome respite. Onwards, and up next we have one of the true heroes and blueprints for games within the genre. Ori and the Blind Forest came out on PC and Xbox on March 2015 with a later 2017 port onto the Switch. Now we've opted to include the original with this countdown rather than the sequel Ori and the Will of the Wisps, which came out earlier in the year for a number of reasons. Don't get us wrong though, we loved the sequel, well apart from those insta-death chase sequences, although on balance, the original game just ever so slightly nudges itself ahead. Where does it do this? Well, for starters, with the sequel, we felt it a little too top-heavy in terms of its focus on boss battle, dramatic sequences and other combat. We felt it had lost some of the overall exploration and careful platforming of the original that to us made it so appealing. The Blind Forest story and world building is also utterly superb, with its hand-drawn perspective really taking you by the hand and heart and then reeling you in for hour after hour. It's breathtaking from the start to the finish, with it being a tremendous achievement and on balance up there with Dead Cells and the next game, the last one on this list, as one of our favourites of all time. And finally, we've reached the last game in this rundown, and one we know so many of you will have at the top of your own Metroidvania must-have and best rundowns. If we're honest though, Hollow Knight didn't grab us as unmissable when we first played it. We found it somewhat of a slog, with it being, well, a tad of a chore if we're honest with you. We are, however, deeply happy we did go back, as much of, let's call it the early frustration in the backtracking and world navigation is made so much easier and better once you've leveled up. There is, again being brutally honest with you, still sections where we think things could have been trimmed to avoid some of the grind, although the pleasure that's here to be had, particularly in the boss battles, can make Hollow Knight so very endearing. Having played the forthcoming sequel Silk Song's demo a few times over the past 18 or so months, we are super happy and excited to see where the next adventure in the Hollow Knight saga takes and leads us. Here's hoping Silk Song makes its way out soon, perhaps this coming holiday period, or more likely we suspect, within the 2021 timeframe. And with that, many thanks for watching. There's no doubt we've missed a few here and there in this video, so feel free to let us know your favourite Metroidvania down in the comments. While you're here, give that like button a gentle caress, and perhaps if you haven't done already, subscribe to the channel with all the notifications turned on. We upload around 3 times a week, and a subscription is the best way to stay up to date with all of our content here on YouTube. Huge thank you to our Patreons, and we'll see you all again next time on Get Indie Gaming.